Hi guys, it's Elisa at Moat Cottage. Today I'm going to show you how I made my drying rack so you can make one too. You will need a few tools to make the drying rack. First up are the bolt cutters, and this is to cut the mesh as well as the chain. Unless you can get them to cut the mesh and the chain wherever you're buying it from to the right lengths. You'll also need a tool for measuring so that you can get everything to the right length, and I use a measuring tape for that. You'll need a drill to drill a hole into the roof to hang the hook. And lastly, some pliers. Now, these aren't necessary, but they do come in handy if you can't get the grip on with your hand to screw the hooks in by hand. Depends how hard your wood is really and how strong your hand is. You need 2 wooden picture frames the same size. And the reason we use wooden frames is because it's easy to screw the hooks in by hand. My picture frames are 25.5 inch by 21.5 inch external measurements. But you really can use any size you want, so long as you're using the right thickness of chain to hold the weight, as well as the hook in the roof. It needs to be able to hold the weight of what you've made. Of course, that takes into account what you're putting on the drying rack. You always have to remember to include that weight as well, because you want it to stay up there nice and strong and not fall out onto the floor, because that would just be horrible. You'll need 2 pieces of mesh that would fit the same size as the glass that would be in the picture frame, so that it can sit in there nicely and not fall out. And you don't even have to secure it in. It just sits there, and the weight of the garlic or whatever you're putting on top of it holds it into place. The mesh I use is steel. It is okay because my food is not touching the metal itself, because I'm drying things like garlic and they're in its skin, and sunflowers, and the actual sunflowers are not touching the rack itself. You'll need 12 hooks. I use 4 hooks that are bigger because they're holding more of the weight, and they're the 4 hooks I have up the top, and then the 8 other hooks are slightly smaller because they're holding less of the weight. You can use all the same size if you like, it's up to you, so long as the ones up the top can hold the weight that you're making the rack into. You'll need 1 curtain ring and some chain. Now, depending on the size of your frames will depend on the size of chain you're using. If you're making a huge, wonderful drying rack, then you're going to need bigger, thicker chains, and the same with the hooks. And if you're making a small one, you can use smaller chain and smaller hooks. So I can only show you what I use for the size that I've made. So just remember to take that into account as well. I will leave the measurements to everything that I've made down below, and you can use that as a guide to help you with making the decisions on what sizes you want with yours if you're not sure. I'm using 4 pieces of 2-foot chain and 4 pieces of 8-inch chain. If you want your drying rack lower, you can also add another piece of chain from the roof hook, so that you've got the 1 piece and then the drying rack comes out from there. So that is another thing you can do as well. And for that, I would use a fairly chunky chain, bigger than the chains that are being used for the rest of the drying rack. You'll also need one of those butterfly hooks that goes into the roof. You drill the hole, it goes into the roof, and it springs open, and the weight is dispersed over a bit greater area. And of course, I prefer to over-engineer, so I use something that is a bit stronger than what I think I'll even need, just in case. To build the rack, what I do first is cut the mesh to the internal size of the picture frame. If your frame had glass or a picture in it, then you can cut the mesh to that size and use that as a template. Or measure both sides and mark out your mesh and cut it to size. Measure twice, cut once. The front of the frame will be the bottom of the rack. And so the bottom rack, the hooks are in the back, and I choose each corner halfway. So you can sort of pick where you want it to be, but keep it uniform wherever you do it. The top frame actually has 8 hooks in it. On the bottom, which is the front of the frame, we have the 4 smaller hooks, and up the top, which is the back of the frame, we have the larger hooks. Now, I also point them in certain directions. Up the top, because the chain's on an angle to get up to the top, I have the hooks pointing in the direction that gives that the most strength and that it's not going to slip off. Because the top frame does have 2 hooks on each side, the larger hooks I put inwards a little bit so that they're staggered and they're not going to hit each other inside the wood. To get the second set of hooks in, I put the frame on a bench so that the hooks can stick it out over the bench, and then I can put pressure on the frame to get those hooks in by hand. Work out where you want to hang your drying rack, mark out where you want your spring toggle hook to go, drill your hole and put that in place. I then cut the chains to the sizes I want, and I put 4 of the chains on the curtain ring. I then put my mesh on the top frame, hang the top frame on by putting the chain onto the hook, and I do that on all 4 corners. Then my 4 pieces of 8-inch chain I hang off those bottom hooks. I then put my mesh in the bottom frame and hang it from the chains that are left. You can also paint your drying rack, the chains, the hooks, whatever colour you want them to be. Just make sure you're using the right paints for metals and woods. To paint the chains, I would just hang it out in the shed on a hook and give it a spray paint and let that dry there. If you have any questions or comments, leave them below. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.